Good morning, fourth grade. Excited here today to help you continue your Native American research, and I'll be doing that by first teaching you about primary sources. So in today's lesson, I hope to teach you what they are and what strategies to use when reading them. So by the end of this lesson, you should have a better understanding of what a primary source is and what strategies as a reader you can use when you come across a primary source in case you do during your research. Now, I want to clarify right now up front, you do not have to find or use a primary resource today. They can be difficult to find, and we understand that as fourth grade teachers. So I myself, Mrs. Culp here, will share some examples of primary sources I was able to find about the Cheyenne tribe that we've been modeling our research about. But to clarify, you do not have to today or at any point use primary sources for your research. If we were in class, we might be able to provide you with some. And in future research, it would be a great idea if you can find some to use them. And you'll hear a little bit more about why historians and people researching history like to use primary sources in their research later in my lesson here. But I just wanted that up front. So no one should be stressing today that they need to find a primary source when taking notes for today's subtopic that you'll be working on collecting notes for. You can use secondary sources and just continue to do research and use the sources that we've provided you and that you've been using and finding helpful so far in your research. Okay. But today, like I said, our focus is to at least become familiar with what a primary source is and better understand, strategies to use when reading them. So our agenda for this lesson today is first to learn, I'll tell you what a primary source is. We'll go over the challenges about reading them when researching, what strategies should we use when reading a primary source. Then I'll actually share with you 2 examples of primary sources about the Cheyenne Native American tribe that I found, and go over our goals for researching today, a few important things to keep in mind while doing your research today. And actually I didn't list it there, but I'll share with you an example of notes I took on the Cheyenne tribe about the subtopic that we all will be working on researching today in our independent work. So to start, what is a primary source? Well, a primary source is a document that originated in the era you are studying. Primary sources can be documents, letters, and even photographs. Why even read or analyze a primary source? You might be wondering that. Well, researchers of history will read and or analyze primary sources because they can give you a powerful sense of history and the complexity of the past. Secondary sources are often filtered through the viewpoint of the author, which can color or maybe alter the interpretation of events. And I think one of the biggest reasons is primary sources were created by the people who lived in a particular place at a particular time. And the viewpoints within the primary source come directly from them. Basically, they allow you to understand the viewpoints of the people who are actually there. So you're able to understand what happened, the event, and that time period from someone who lived it. It's more of an original resource, if you think about that. Challenges, though. You will face them when reading or analyzing a primary source. And some of the challenges you might come across are that it can be difficult to read because they were written in the past and often in what seems like old-fashioned English. Because it was created in the past, it can be hard to see the conditions under which it was written. It can be hard to figure out at first who wrote it, who was the receiver who received the document, or even who or what it was about, especially when it's a photograph. It could be written in a different language. It could be a photograph with no text or caption to explain it, and just a black and white photograph since it's older, so it's even harder to maybe understand where it was taken. They often require higher order thinking and critical thinking and analysis skills to understand them. So with that being said, what strategies do we use when reading or analyzing a primary source? Well, first, it helps to be a detective. So I need you guys to put on those detective hats and think about being a detective, trying to figure out who wrote it, when, and why. Because without understanding that information, you really can't get anything out of the primary document in terms of your understanding and what you could add to your research. It's important to take the time to study and look at all parts of the document and image, even any tiny fonts or handwriting, any little tiny parts of the photograph. You really have to look at every little detail to truly be able to understand and get all the information out of that primary document that you can. think about the time period and what was going on when it was created. It really helps to think of it from that perspective and keep that in mind when being a detective and trying to figure these things out. Take your time, and I haven't stressed it enough, in analyzing the image or document, okay? It's not like you can just read a few sentences and grab the information and jot it in your notes. You need to actually analyze and study this primary document before you go to, jotting your notes. Most of all, when you come across a primary source, readers need to ask these questions when analyzing a primary source. There's 5 questions that you should always ask. Number 1, what do you notice? Just stop and think, what do you notice? Almost like when we were doing our TDAs and we were reading a text, as readers, we stop to say, okay, what's the gist? What is it really all about? You're going to do something just like that. What do you notice? What do I notice about the photograph? Or what do I notice about the document or the letter? What type of document is it? Like I just said, when you're noticing different things, one of the things you should notice is the type. Is it a photograph? Is it a letter? Is it a news article, like in a newspaper? Who created it? And that can sometimes be more tricky to figure out. So you need to be put on that detective hat there and think, okay, who was it by? Who made it? When and where was it made? And why was it created? Okay. An example of a primary source here is example number 1. I found this photograph, okay, and I got it off of a site that was a national database of primary sources. And the title of it is the Cheyenne Peyote Leader. And it says the contributors' names. That means the person who created this photograph was Curtis Edward S., and that he lived from 1868 to 1952. He was the photographer. So when I study this image, I can first figure out here that, okay, it's a photograph of a Cheyenne Peyote leader. So that's one of the leaders there. I can notice, the kind of, dress, the clothing that he wore. Looks like a beadwork on the necklace there. It's definitely an older leader. I can tell by, the wrinkles in his skin there. And it was taken by Curtis Edward S., and it was created or published, and that means circa, 1927. So the photograph is one from 1927. So in my research there, if I was writing about leaders, I might use this photograph included in my presentation. The one tough part here is I don't really know which Cheyenne Peyote leader this is. So I would maybe have to do some further research to find that out. And that can be the tricky part about primary sources, especially photographs. Here's another example of a primary source. This is the second example I have for you here. And it's actually the first page of a 22-page document. And it's the reply of Governor Evans, okay, so of the territory of Colorado. So I'm assuming from that I can infer he was a governor in Colorado. And it says of the reports of the Committee of the Conduct of War. So it was about the Committee and Conduct of War. And it was headed Massacre of Cheyenne Indians. So it looks like from here, when I look at it, it's about the Massacre of Cheyenne Indians. And it says to the public. So it looks like it's a reply of. And if it's a reply, that means it's of Governor Evans. So it's of him. And it looks like since it says to the public, it was to the public. And I can infer that here says to that, the part referring to him of the report of the Committee of the Conduct of War. So I'm thinking this Governor Evans here, the governor, was in the committee, and they were talking about the conduct of war and the massacre of Cheyenne Indians. And it says Executive Department, Denver, August 6, 1865, to the public. Yeah, and it says created, published year, Denver, 1865, by who? John Evans, Colorado governor, 1862 to 1865. So it was his last year as governor, and it came from the Library of Congress miscellaneous pamphlet collection. So it's really here, it's written to the public about, the massacre of the Cheyenne Indians. So, reading this would be definitely difficult because it was obviously written in 1864. But you could read this, and it's, like I said, a 22-page document, and this was just the first page. You can even see, like I said, how did I figure out some of the dates and things here if I didn't have this information here on the side that they provided me? I had to look at the small dates here. I looked at to the public here, and it says copy 2. So this is like a copy of the first one. And then I looked up here to see what it was about, the conduct of the war. So I asked, when I think about those different questions that I talked about, if I go back to the slide, what do I notice? Well, I noticed how old it was, the paper. I noticed that it's a reply of Governor Evans, and that it's the governor, territory of Colorado. I can infer that, and it says to the public, so it must have been like a letter to the public about this. It says, what type of document is it? I just answered that. Who created it? Governor Evans. I figured that out. And then when and where was it made and why was it created? Well, when and where, Denver, Colorado. And when I looked here at the date, it says Denver, August 6th, 1865. So when and where, I figured that out. What was it about? It was about the massacre of the Cheyenne Indians and the conduct, that took place during that war there. I'd have to read further more here and maybe go on to the next page to really understand more about what it's about and why it was written. So you can see how I use those questions to guide me as a reader and as a strategy to use when analyzing this primary source. Today you'll be taking notes on section 6, what are homes like? Maybe you come across a primary source, maybe you don't. Like I said at the beginning of this lesson, you do not have to use a primary source. What you do need to do today, though, is make sure you fill out the Google form for today's ELA lesson. There will be a question on what primary sources are and what strategies primary readers use when reading a primary source. Think about those 5 main questions that I just showed you back here. That would hint would be the strategies that readers use. And I know in the beginning I shared with you what a primary document was. After that, you do need to make sure you take notes on what their homes are like. When you're taking when you're taking notes on what their homes are like, come a few reminders. At the top of the next page in your notes, make sure you write down the subtopic at the top. What are their homes like? Then the title and URL of the resources you're using. Write down the information in your own words in an organized way that matches that text structure. And then continue looking for information about where they live in multiple, not where they live, about what their homes are like in multiple sources. So not just using one resource, but using multiple. And an example of notes I took here about what the Cheyenne homes are like is right here. You can see, and I know Ms. Herzog mentioned this, I used one color for my first resource, which was the Cheyenne, and it was a book by Kevin Cunningham and Peter Benoit. And I said, what are their homes? What were their homes like? Boxes. And then it was bullets because then they had key details. Like I learned they used teepees instead of wigwams because they could easily and quickly be put up and taken down, and they lived in villages. And that's all I could find in that book, and that really wasn't much information. So I looked for another resource. You can see in yellow here, resource 2, Cheyenne Tribe, and it was taken from that Duxter's website that I'm sure some of you have used in your own research. Again, I noticed main idea, key details, so I have the box, what were their homes like, and the details I learned here were that early Cheyenne lived in permanent earth lodges, and it was the Cheyenne of the Great Plains that lived in teepees that they made out of buffalo hides and wooden poles. And the teepees were easy to move from one place to another. So by looking in that second resource, I did gain some new information about the early Cheyenne and about what the teepees were made out of. And I gained, confirmation. I saw that it was repeated that the reason they used teepees were because they were easy to move. They could easily be quickly put up and taken down and moved from one place to another. So this example of notes will be attached to the assignment. Again, you do not have to use a primary resource today in your research, but you do need to fill out the ELA Google form, answer the questions on it, and take notes on section 6. What are their homes like for the tribe that you've chosen and you have been researching? And then don't forget to go back and click submit on the Google form. Thank you for listening to this. There's only one part of the video, so hopefully that helps you better understand what a primary source is, what strategies as a reader to use when trying to understand a primary source, and give you an example of notes that you should be taking on section 6 today. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.